away to Satan when we, nature abhors a vacuum. And Satan came in once we gave up our authority and we're no longer able to hear God and communicate with God. He became the prince and the power of the air. Now, it's all phony authority. And you were given authority over Satan, over evil, over death, all these things that Satan loves to throw at us. We know that Jesus says all authority has been given on heaven and earth. And he says, I give you my name, and if you ask anything in my name, I will do it. So anyway, the Holy Spirit empowers us to do ministry. And it's not just human effort. Now, I want to cover that. We talked about holy optimism and a God who is able. Talked about prayer. We talked about the Myers-Briggs last time. Now, anybody have any questions or comments on any of that stuff? As far as what we've talked about so far. We are kind of putzing our way through this and the way that the year has worked out. Every year it kind of falls differently, and it's this year we kind of got messed up by the schedule, the way the schedule has worked out. So I feel like we're a little disjointed. Anybody have any questions or comments on anything? Stories, recipes? Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about this. Is an extremely important concept. This is one of the other handful of things I want you to bring out of this class, and we will talk about this and talk about this and talk about this. I hope it'll keep coming up. But I want to talk about the spatula principle. What is that? We also call that an access point. Okay, when I was a young guy, 45 years ago this fall, starting out as how can that possibly be? Starting out as a youth director, I got together with a bunch of the kids every, Monday morning or Friday morning, it moved different times, and we got together and I cooked them breakfast and made pancakes, and I cooked them each a pancake, and then we did a Bible study while we're cooking and talking over Scripture. And I learned that with the little frying pan we had, I couldn't do what my mom did, made all these nice little pancakes about this big, because I couldn't get them fed and get them to school in time if I did that. So I finally settled on the idea I would make them each one Mongo pancake, which is basically filling the pan with pancake batter. Now, I learned one thing the very first time I made a full pan pancake. How do you get it back out of there? And so I learned that you pour them so that there's one little spot in the bottom where there's no batter. You got one little spot where you can still see pan, and the rest of it was all filled, but there'd be a little, like your fingernail, the little moon on the bottom of your fingernail, you'd leave a spot like that so that you get the spatula under them. Although you can try to flip them, but you have to scrape them off the ceiling maybe, or otherwise you break them all up and you kind of make scrambled pancakes. The kids don't like that. So anyway, I learned to do that, and I could get the spatula under there and flip them over, and Pancake City. And I'd get them all fed, and we'd have our Bible study, and I'd drive them over to their 3 different high schools, and that was that. But I learned that if I was going to do this, I had to have a spot for the spatula to go. And I prepared that so that I would have a way to get that spatula under there. Now, God, I believe, with every people group, with every point of ministry, God has provided a spatula point. God has prepared the people for ministry. Now, that's one of our presuppositions, and I've seen this over and over again. If you come in with your program, your idea, or the way somebody else did it, it probably isn't going to work. They were successful because they studied and they learned and they found God's pre-prepared access point. Let me tell you a story. Have any of you ever read the book Brushko? Okay, it's been in print for many, many years. It's a story of Bruce, is it Olson? Bruce Olson. And he was a kid growing up in the 50s, early 60s, and his parents weren't Christians. And he had a deep experience with the Lord, and he believed the Lord was calling him to South America to go up one of the rivers and become a missionary. And he's like 18. And against his parents' wishes, he bought himself a one-way ticket, got to the coast, and I think it was at Venezuela or Colombia. One of those two, I get them mixed up. And he came to the place, and God later gave him the name of the group he was supposed to go see, the Motilone. And so he'd come up to people, and speaking very little Spanish, he'd say, how do I find the Motilone? And people looked at him like, what? So he just prayed, and he started going up the river, one of these rivers from the main big city on the coast. And he got up there a ways, and he asked, where are the Motilone? And they said, Motilone, they're way back in the woods. They're way back there, and oh, by the way, nobody ever comes back out again. You got to stay away from the Motilone because everybody gets killed. Well, he went in there anyway, and he went in, and he just basically came and presented himself, and he began to follow them around and learn their language, and they didn't kill him. And he dressed like they dressed, and he gradually learned their ways and learned how to eat bugs and all that stuff, drank the water out of the river and so on. And at one point he got so sick he was dying, and so the parasites were crawling out of his body because they knew that he was dying. It's quite an interesting story. Young guys just love that part. Anyway, and so the natives brought him down to where there were white people because he couldn't handle that. And they gave him medicine. He got better, and he went right back to the Motilone again. And he's learned to eat monkeys and cook monkeys and run around barefoot in a loincloth. And well, after a couple of years, he gets a sense that he's supposed to whip out his Bible. They've known him, they've trusted him, hunted him, they've accepted him. And he whips out his Bible. They've never seen a book before. These are Stone Age people. No written language. Nobody had ever been in with them. They've kept everybody else away. And he pulls out the Bible. Anybody get a softcover Bible? Okay, yeah. Crocodiles from the jungle there. Okay, so when he takes out his Bible, they've never seen a book before, and they see him open it, and they say, banana sheaf, banana sheaf, banana sheaf, banana sheaf, and they're all excited. Now, isn't that what people do when you whip out your Bible? Youth groups, every youth group in the world calls it a banana sheaf, right? No. He said, what do you mean banana sheaf? And they said, well, once upon a time, and he'd never heard them say this before, there was one supreme God, one God over all other gods, and they worshipped all kinds. And they said, and our people lost that God. But our people told us that someday someone would come with a banana sheaf and would teach us the way back to the true God. And he began to teach them and tell them stories and tell them what was there. And there was a people movement, and virtually this whole tribe became believers overnight because they'd been prepared. Don, there's a guy, Heaven in Their Hearts, anybody know that book? There's a whole book about experiences of people groups that Don Richardson, yeah, and he also wrote The Peace Child, but where God has prepared people with a need. Now, this isn't just tribes out in the middle of Pango. I talk every once in a while about Yonggi Cho. Yonggi Cho was a leader in Korea, largest church in the world, 800,000 members. And they grew this church just through cell groups. and they have thousands and thousands of house church pastors, and they meet in their cell groups every week, and the house church pastors visit their cell, each of their members, once a week in person, and they each cell group covenants to add to their group X number of people in 6 months or a year. And so they're always looking for people who are hurting. And in Seoul, typically women do not work outside the home, and an awful lot of people live in high-rises. So some of their people just ride up and down and up and down and up and down the elevator all day, just talking to people. Hi, how are you doing? How are you? Where are you hurting? Is there something I can pray for you about? And so they expect their cell group to grow by X number of people. They expect that God has prepared these people. They say, and maybe it's a little more Calvinistic than I might be, but they say that forgive me, I know that God has prepared them with divine desperation. They're in a situation where God has put them in a position that they're getting desperate. Now, there's some stuff in Lamentations that would deal with that. Let no one say they're being tempted by God. I don't know where all the hassles come from. I think they can come from a lot of different places. But they recognize that, and they look for people. Now, you're surrounded every day by people who are, in big trouble. And all they do is they just love these people in the kingdom. They surround them with a cell group, and whatever the person's need is, they help work that out. And they've built a church out of 800,000 people by just teaching their people to keep their eyes open. That is the critical skill that we hope you will learn from this class. Now, we're going to give you some tools next semester that talk about how you deal with people that are going through, mental illness or problems with kids and drugs, and helping to understand how some of these relationship things work, and chemical dependency, and just to give you a start in some of these areas, because if you're going to be dealing with people, these are the places that people hurt. And you're surrounded all your life with people who are hurting. And it may be old hurts, it may be new hurts, but each of us have wounds. Each of us have scars, and if we get to know each other well enough so that we trusted one another and started talking about that, we'd probably find out all kinds of stuff. I had a secretary in a church many years ago that very successful student and very successful, was one of the top homecoming queen and top cheerleader, and just a tremendous believer and very optimistic and so forth. And some stories came on about kids being sexually abused, and that's kind of pulled the cork. And she sat down and said, I was abused as a child, and you can't believe what all people have gone through. Each of you have your own wounds and places of rejection and so on. But as we deal with people, and as we learn about their hurts, and we make ourselves vulnerable and talk and build intimacy. Intimacy is the key. We'll talk about that in a few weeks. As we build intimacy, as we learn about where people are hurting, we can build a relationship. Relationships happen when people get to the point of learning one another and getting to that point of intimacy. The church functions. The church should function at the point of intimacy. There's an awful lot of churches that are not churches because they never get to the point that people develop intimacy, trust. They can talk about their stuff. Have you ever been, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but just think, have you ever been a part of a Christian fellowship where people could talk about their stuff? Yeah. Can you bear one another's burdens? Can you talk about the deep hurts? Those become access points, not to manipulate people, but to build relationships. And when you build a relationship like that, now you got to be careful about, intimacy, boy, girl, male, female, and so forth, because it can become sexualized and, so on. But people are very, we've got almost no intimacy. I mean, we tell the whole world everything we do, we have peanut butter sandwich for breakfast or whatever. But as far as developing a point where we actually have intimacy, to have family and to have clan and to have tribe, people, that's hardwired deep inside of us, people that are supposed to be around us. And if those things aren't functioning, there's the people that make polar fleece. I love that stuff. The nice fuzzy stuff. The guy, they make it out of old pop bottles. When they need more capacity, they don't add on to the plant. They build a new plant, and I don't know if the number is 100 or 120 or 150, but when they get to the point of X number of workers, they think that that's the optimum function or optimum size so that people know each other and trust each other, and they feel like they're part of something. And so they go ahead and they build another plant so that their people can have meaningfulness in work. That's what a church is. There's this magic thing that churches, I mean, typically most churches, of their members, about 1/3 attend on any given Sunday total. I mean, you've got some people who are there every Sunday, and they're, all the way out to people who know which church is theirs to stay away from. But they might have, 600 members, but on any given Sunday, it'd probably have about 200 people there. And congregations tend to grow up to that number, and then when they get past that number, division forms, and they split and they grow back up to that number. And I think that that's indicative of something probably along the line of either clan or tribe. Those are the number of people that you can have a significant relationship with. Churches in the 800 to 1,200 member are very prone. 800 members divided, by 3, just a little over 200. Those congregations have all kinds of strife. Bigger than that, they have less because you can't have 2 power centers. You get smaller than that, and there's only 1 power center. So anyway, but intimacy is important, and we're very hungry for it because we don't have it any place in our lives. All right, somebody read for me Acts 17:28, please. Okay.
For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring.
Okay, that's from Paul's speech in the Areopagus. Now, these are the smartest guys, the most educated guys, this is the most happening place. This would be a combination of Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge and the Mayo Clinic and the Congress of the United States and the UN, and these were the smartest people in the world in Paul's time. And he decided he was going to share the gospel with them. And how does he do it? Well, he goes in and he's walking around the city looking, and he comes up with this to an unknown God altar. And I've mentioned that before. And he uses that as his access point. God has prepared this. And he also quoted a couple of their poets to them. Those were access points. So he could take the message and tie it to their reality, to their culture, to their city, and so on. So that's what that's about. God had prepared that. Each place Paul goes, we could take a look and find the access point. There were the women meeting down at the side of the river. And each time there's a place. Think of Cornelius, the preparation that had happened, that Paul, or even Saul. One of my favorite stories in the whole Bible is Ananias is praying, and God says, "Oh, by the way, I'm sending Saul of Tarsus to come to you today," and that's kind of like saying, Stalin is or Hitler on his way. The SS are on their way to. Let me get out of here. My feet don't fail me now. And God says, "No. And by the way, he's blind right now. I struck him blind, and you're going to heal him." Now, people who are blind, even today, if you're blind, a lot of, it's very difficult to heal somebody that's blind. Maybe cataracts or something you have, but Anyway, and then Saul shows up, and Ananias has the guts to say, Saul, God's healing you. And scales fall off his eyes, and, God works through all kinds of crises, all kinds of situations. And God will prepare those places if you take enough time to poke around. I brought this up a few weeks ago, I think, talking about, we talked about, is it the second book of the Lord of the Rings, and they're stuck. They can't get over the top of the mountains, and there's a pool behind them. There's something like an octopus that's grabbing the ponies and it says in Elvish, "Speak, friend," and they're trying to open up this magic door, and they can't find a keyhole. They can't find and Gandalf is trying to get his way in there, and they're trying all sorts of different things, and then Gandalf realizes I think it's Gandalf, isn't it? Says, in Elvish he says, "Friend," and the door begins to creak open after hundreds of years. And there was an access point, there was a code, there was whatever. And when you're talking with people, the Holy Spirit, if God truly desires that all people are saved, if God desires people to come to him, we have to trust that God has prepared their hearts. But you don't hit that just glancing off of them and meeting him in 5 minutes. I mean, that may be what God uses. But on the other hand, most ministry today happens slowly. It's caught. They're slowly magnetized, as I talked about last week, and that's maybe confronting them with the gospel or sharing it. Maybe it'll be just at that point things are ready, that things happen. But whatever, to take the time. Yes, we've got to trust that faith comes from hearing. What is heard is the preaching of Christ. It's by the power of God's word. We've got to bring the word. That's critical. I mean, that's what our job is. But to come to that with the right key that fits the right lock, and to understand the people group, to understand the culture, to understand how to build a friendship, all of that is very, very critical. Okay, does that make sense? Questions, comments?
What is the name of the book with the guy that went to
Brushko, B.
Okay, that's the one.
Yeah, I think it's spelled right.
I think it's supposed to be with a C instead of an S. I tried to look it up on Amazon.
Okay, thank you. Oh, I've got a... They can't say Bruce Olson, so they say Brushko. Brushko. Oh, footnote. My son was a cultural anthropology major at Bethel. And one day, and he was a TA in his senior year, and he was in the hall, and this old white-haired guy comes toddling in, and he says, "Have you got any cultural anthropology classes meeting right now? I'd like to talk to him." And Tim's thinking, and the guy says, "My name is Bruce Olson." And he sat with the cultural anthropology classes for a couple hours and just told them stories. And Tim said he was just in awe. All right, so when we're dealing with people, what we want, if we're talking about human need and interpreting the situation, we're going to look for this access point. We're going to look for that spatula point. And we're going to seek who is God calling us to love into the kingdom. Now, all kinds of people come into this neighborhood, and they're going to minister to the neighborhood. Now, you've got people here who make no income. You have people here who are mentally ill. In group homes, you've got people who are mentally handicapped here. There are people FOB fresh off the boat. There are people who have been here for, from other countries for 2 generations. There are people here from over 100 different language groups, we believe, at any given time. And just because there's a language group doesn't mean they want to have anything to do with each other, because, For example, if you're dealing with people from India, well, they might all be from India, but there's so many different subdivisions, and even if they speak the same, if they all speak Hindi as their first language, or even English, still, typically a person who's an upper caste Hindu doesn't want to hang around with or doesn't feel comfortable with a lower caste Hindu. And that's, you know, that makes a difference. People are separated by age. The idolatry of ageism, don't get me started. That's weakening our church like crazy. So if you aim at nothing, you'll hit it every time, and if you aim at everything, you'll hit nothing. Both are true. If you aim at everything, if you aim at nothing, you'll hit it every time, and if you aim at everything, you'll hit nothing. Sometimes people get all excited when a big flock of ducks come by and they just start shooting, and it doesn't work. You can't flock shoot. You know, it's not the day of the market hunter where you're shooting a huge shotgun that is anchored down on the side of the boat, and you don't have, even if you're flock shooting, if you've got lots of ducks, it's not like, you know, clouds of ducks like there were in the 1870s. But so you have to take aim, very specific aim, and ministry is not a shotgun approach. Ministry with people is pretty much aimed. Okay, so who is God calling us to love in the kingdom? So you wanted to start, when you learn about a people group, say you're going to be studying a people group starting in the end of January. We're going to start talking about how do we begin to look for ministry, and we're going to say, well, all right, if you're going to be in an area, you got to figure out who the people groups are and who's unreached. And if you're going to be doing ministry to a group, a targeting group, it's probably in a group that has 3 people in it. Could be that's who God leads you to. But it probably has to be big enough to have enough people so that you have a people group, and you have to find a cohesive subgroup within that people group. It might be single moms, might be young guys. Some of our great plans that people have put together have been, dealing with Somali single moms in a particular neighborhood with these particular needs. Group did a good study, and they found some of the needs that those moms had. Studying, we had a lot of people in this neighborhood a few years ago who were from the Andean countries, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and they would come together in the evenings out here in the park, and they would play 3-person, it was always guys, also forgive me, 3-man echo volley. And echo volley is a game of cutthroat basketball. You could do almost anything. Everybody would pay a $50 fee, and they'd maybe have 20 teams, and whoever was the winning team at the end of the season got all the money. Maybe it was even $50 a person. I don't know. It was a lot of money. And I've never seen people fly through the air or play the kind of cutthroat volleyball. And you could palm it. You could do all kinds of things that you can't normally do. But these little guys who were all, 5'1", 5'2", were out there playing this volleyball. It was fascinating to watch, and they were really good at it. The ball would be up in the air, back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth. Whoops, there it went. And so we knew there were a lot of young guys, and there weren't any young women with them. And so we did some studying on that. And a lot of these Ecuadorian, Peruvian, Bolivian guys would come up here to work, and all of a sudden they've got money, and they've got temptations, and they were developing a lot of chemical dependency. And so they started looking at this group of people, and our team came up with, well, really what's needed is an AA group. And because these people probably spoke Quechua as their primary language and Spanish as their secondary language, and they probably really wouldn't mix with Latinos from Argentina or from Mexico, because it's a very different people group, and they see themselves, and even their form of Spanish is different. They don't say chaquete, they say chompa. and they've got a whole bunch of different words for things. And so they really needed to be ministered to, but those three countries together had enough in common that they could work with those guys, and they had a community that did that. So you got to do your homework. You got to do your homework. You got to do your homework. If far too many good people have failed simply because they didn't understand the challenge that was ahead of them or where to begin. When you do ministry, it's kind of like a big plate of spaghetti. And, where do you start? Where's the end of the spaghetti? I mean, if it's endless spaghetti, how do you just bite it? Well, no, you got to find the end. You got to pick it apart. And that's the challenge. And that's one of the things why we set out 24 years ago to try to create a class, was to teach people to, you're not going to do ministry to everybody in this neighborhood. No one ministry is going to be able to do ministry to everybody who's here, because they're just not going to fit together. Particularly if they're immigrants, they're not going to have enough English to be able to do things all together. Get what I mean? Is this making sense? Okay, so look at this. Okay, Acts 3, 1 through 6. Somebody read that. Are you our Bible reader tonight? Okay. Go ahead. Okay, maybe that's the fastest way to do that. Nice and loud. Here, I'll bring the microphony over here.
Now Peter and John were going up to the temple at the hour of prayer, the 9th hour. And a man lame from birth was being carried, whom they laid daily at the gate of the temple called the Beautiful Gate, to ask alms of those entering the temple. Seeing Peter and John about to go into the temple, he asked to receive alms. And Peter directed his gaze at him, as did John, and said, "Look at us." And he fixed his attention on them, expecting to receive something from them. But Peter said, "I have no silver or gold, but what I do have I give to you. In the name of Christ Jesus of Nazareth, rise up and walk."
Now this also reminds me a lot of Jesus and the paralytic at the pool of Bethesda. Is that 4 is the woman at the well. 6 is I'm talking about John, Gospel of John. 6 is the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, the living bread, and the whole thing on the Lord's Supper. I'm trying to remember, is it chapter 5 or chapter 7 where you've got this whole thing on the healing of the paralytic? Anyway, Jesus comes up to this guy and he says, "Do you want to be healed?" He's been laying, I've been laying here for, 38 years or something. And he says, yeah, and every time the water's troubled, somebody else gets in there first, and so it never works. And Jesus says, "No, that's not what I asked." He said, "Do you want to be healed?" And Jesus tells him, "Rise, stand up," And then everybody starts arguing, isn't that the guy who laid there? No, it looks like him, but it's not, because they'd never accepted him as a human being. They had never, no, I put it face down. And so they have this big argument, and it's a lot like the man born blind. It's the same kind of thing. Although the focus of the guy at the pool of Bethesda is that he's got all these excuses. And he, much like this story, this other guy had it all figured out as to what his needs were. Did you, well, there's nobody, and there's never anybody who can throw me into the pool, and it's just, he's begging and begging, and Jesus says, well, okay, or Paul says, well, we don't, silver or gold have we none. There was an old song we used to sing in the 70s, which I won't regale you with. But in the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, rise up and walk. And he went walking and leaping and praising God, and I won't do that. This is a filled out copy with all of the answers in it. Anyway, this is the difference between perceived need and actual need. Now, people come in here all the time and ask for money, and I have given away, up here someplace it says sucker. My dad was turned away from the church when he was a young man and really needed help. And so I never forget that. And when somebody comes for help, I mean, I have been fooled by the best and I've been fooled by the worst. But should the whole world prove false, let me prove true, or let the church prove true. But a lot of people think that what their real need is a $20 bill and a few rocks to crack. But that's not really their need. Now, getting at that base need is a huge challenge, and that may be coming up further on. Back post-war, government, sociologists, anthropologists said, well, the problem, poor people are poor because they don't have money. Duh. So we started giving people money. Things didn't get better. So then they discovered, well, people really, what they really need is a job, so they have got self-esteem, and so they, are feeling productive and so on. And so they worked, they had make work projects, and where people would work and but the trouble was is that people didn't know how to hold a job, and they weren't trained for a job. So then they started things like Job Corps and so forth, where there was training for jobs, and that was good. But when they started training, then they discovered that the problem was they couldn't read. So then they started having to do remedial education. Now, we started out with giving away money, and then we ended up with remedial education, and that was really, really good. But they discovered the problem was that kids, the problem was in school, but like in my wife's school, my wife had a little boy come from another big city a few years ago, and he entered second grade. He'd been passed through kindergarten. He'd been passed through first grade. And he started second grade, came out of the Chicago schools. I guess that's adequate. He didn't, as he began second grade, and he was a smart little boy, but he didn't know his colors, he didn't know his letters, he didn't know his numbers, and he didn't even know his own last name. So emphasis began on early childhood, so we ended up with Head Start and programs like that. So we started out with money, and we keep going deeper and deeper, and now we know that there's chaos of the family, and there are programs that churches can have and that the government can have with that stuff. And yet we see more and more chaos, and this is true in the permanent lower class of southern Minnesota. Same thing is true in Duluth. Same thing is true in Montana. Same thing is true in the big cities, is that we have developed a chaotic underclass. And again, I will say that I think right now in the core, my mind has changed on this a few times, but if you peel the onion back, and I know I'm repeating myself, but it's important. I think the center of the onion is three things. I think it's chemical dependency, mental illness, and multi-generational, almost intentional single-parent families, where the idea of how relationships between a man and a woman can be sustained. And I think that those three things, and one might cause the other, I don't know. But it seems to me that that's kind of the core. Well, if you're going to do ministry in the city, where are you going to do it? How are you going to do, what's really the need here? Jesus, or Paul or not Paul, John and Peter, come to this guy, and he said, well, I need money, and silver and gold we don't have. So to get to the need, so we're going to talk more about that. We talked about divine desperation, that they look for hurting people. Okay. So if we're going to deal with this stuff, we're going to learn a group. And we're going to learn next semester a whole process on how to learn a group. Now, there's a lot of ways you could probably do it. Problem is people don't do it. People don't learn the culture. Now, that's why we spent weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks showing you all the different aspects of what makes up a culture. And that's critical. That's to talk about what is a culture, but how do you learn a culture? How do you figure out a subgroup within a culture? What defines the group? Where do they, In a small town in southern Minnesota, you could do an anthropological study, and you could see that there are fault lines. There's the Lutherans and the Catholics, and there's the Church of Christ and maybe a few Methodists. Okay, that's one fault line. A small town, it was my first call. There were people who lived west of the creek in the new part, and there were people that lived east of the creek in the old part, and that was a fault line. There was a fault line between or an identity of those who were part of the American Legion in town. But there was another group that hung out at the municipal, the Muni, and those were groups of people that had identities. There were the town people, and there were the farm people, and there were also the lake people, because there's a chain of lakes there, and there were a lot of people that, back in the 70s, you could buy a nice lake cabin on a decent lot. You could buy it for $30,000, $35,000. You could put some insulation in it, and you could have a lake home for $30,000. And before then, it was even cheaper than that. In the early mid-70s, you could buy a lake home for $15,000. Think about that. Housing has really gone up. Of course, there's two things God isn't making anymore. That's antiques and lakeshore. So, all right. So even a group that looks fairly homogeneous will have fault lines. If you're going to do ministry, you have to, even in that congregation, there were rivalries from high school. And if this group would become involved in a Bible study, this group wouldn't come. In one congregation. Going back to high school, going back to grade school. Come on, people. So what you want to do is you want to learn, and you want to learn where the fault lines are, and you want to see which lines you can cross, and you want to see how you're going to do ministry. Working with Native Americans. At some point, there was you couldn't work with both Dakota people and Ojibwe people because they had been enemies and they still didn't quite get along. So you learn the specifics. How do you do it? Well, you got this thing, maybe you've heard of it, called the internet. 20 years ago, you had to go to the library. There was these things called libraries. And you'd have to go look in the National Geographics, and you'd have to look at studies, and you'd go to the World Book, or you go to the encyclopedias, and you go to the almanacs, and you learn what was going on in the cities. Hey, you can go to any people group today or any city, and there's thousands of pages that will come up after you Google it. You can find out tons and tons of information. The Mormons have a huge database of information on every conceivable immigrant group. The Southern Baptists have worked on having something like that, and they've been somewhat successful, but that's had ups and downs too. But you can learn a ton about people and how they understand things. How does their government work? Why are people leaving that country? What separates the people? In Spain, there's still enmity based on the civil war that happened in the 1930s, just below the surface. And these are all separating people, and they're going to make a difference. So where are the cultural boundaries between people, and what differentiates them? And that's going to be important. All right, so as you're interpreting a situation, again, what are the needs? What caused the needs? What are the true needs that we just talked about? And those are all important questions that you keep looking deeper and deeper as to what's really causing this. Now, if you're going to be dealing with people's problems, it's critical that you get down to figuring out what in the world is really going on. And you've got to pray for wisdom to figure out what's going on. You're all writing like crazy. Questions about this? Comments about this?
You said the three core needs that you understood: multi-generational, single family, chemical dependency, and what was the third?
Mental illness, yeah. People medicate because of mental illness. A lot of drug use and addiction comes because people are medicating for depression, medicating for schizophrenia. Some people think that schizophrenia can be triggered by some of the drugs. LSD, you know, and you talk to drug counselors, and you know, is this person's schizophrenia developed after they use a lot of LSD over a few years? Was it caused by the LSD, or were they self-meding? Nobody can answer that. Self-medicating. Well, in any given order, chemical dependency, mental illness, now this is a touchy one because I have tremendous respect for single parents, and I'm not trying to throw stones at anybody who's a single parent. It's very hard staying married today. But there are communities in which marriage has almost disappeared. And those communities can be all kinds of places. But whether it's created by being a permanent underclass, or whether it is the result of a permanent underclass, just the same thing, or whether the permanent underclass is caused by generational single-parent families, I don't know. And I'm very sensitive on that one because that you're going to really offend people. You know, well, my daughter was divorced. It wasn't her fault. Well, I'm not talking about that. I'm just saying that when you take a look at poverty, you know, the statistics are that the fastest route to poverty is going through a divorce, and it's hard on the kids. I'm not judging anybody. I'm not trying to be mean to anybody. I'm just saying that when families go 3 and 4 generations without having an intact marriage or any kind of marriage, it's hard on the kids, especially boys, because there's no adult male figure there to kind of whip them into shape, and they need that, especially as young teenagers. I don't mean beatings, I just mean they need a father figure. Your job of men teaching in grade school is incredibly important. Not only for young males in just preteen, that's incredibly important, but girls too. Girls, especially in early teens, who don't have a father's attention, will find attention. And that's a real, you know, the same-sex attention, you know, 11, 12, 10, 11, 12, 13, and then 13, 14, 15, the opposite sex parent. Both of those things are really, really important. And dads, if you have girls, as your baby girls start becoming young women, I remember a family I worked with many, many years ago, and firstborn was a daughter, and she was her daddy's pride and joy. In fact, 2 families that went through this. And the girls were the daddy's pride and joy, but when the girls hit puberty, the dads quit hugging them, they quit holding them. You know, these girls were used to jumping in their daddy's lap, and all of a sudden their dad would freeze because he didn't feel comfortable. Something was going on. Devastating for the daughters because they just felt tremendous rejection and they couldn't figure out why. And it was very, very hard. They acted out in different ways. And moms, same thing with little boys. You know, even though they don't like to be kissed or cuddled or held when they're 13, 14 years old, they need it. Anyway, okay, now number 8 is just one little artifact that's in there because it doesn't fit anyplace else. For $500 or a free trip to Hugo, my choice, does anybody know what a sea anchor is? And sailing in boats, yeah. How many of you ever saw the movie A Perfect Storm? About 20 years old now. Okay. They have a choice between going into the storm and getting sunk, or they can run away from the storm and lose their catch because they'll run out of fuel in the refrigerator or the freezers to catch all this catch. And they were about to go bankrupt, and the catch would have saved them, so they really couldn't afford to run away from the storm. And they're really on the horns of a dilemma. But they finally decided to try to turn away. They were going into the storm, and they decided to turn and try to run for it. But the problem is they're in big seas, and if a ship is going into big waves, it's pretty safe. If a ship is running away from the waves, it's pretty safe. But if a ship gets sideways in waves, it'll capsize in big waves. And in fact, I hate to ruin the movie for the rest of you, when they make the decision that they're going to try to outrun the storm because they can't make it into the storm, they can't go any further, when they turn around, it rolls them and they die. So how do they keep from getting in trouble? How do they keep their nose or their stern pointed into the wind? That's where a sea anchor comes from. If it's too deep to drop an anchor will drag along the bottom, and that would be good. But if they're in 1,000 feet of water, there isn't enough. They can't possibly reach the bottom. So they throw out this parachute-y type thing. And so the wind is blowing on them and blowing on them, and if it's either out the stern or if it's out the bow, it's like a tail on a kite. And so what happens then is that when the ship is blown, it doesn't turn sideways because you've got this string going out the back with a parachute that's dragging in the water. So the sea anchor keeps it going straight, either into the storm or away from the storm, so it doesn't capsize. It's a drag on the boat. What does that mean? I'm impatient by nature. I'm getting better, but I'm getting really old. I don't feel that way, but oh well. Anyway, when I was young, I would get so frustrated. I remember when I was youth director, we had a pastor who was the administrative pastor, and he was always asking terrible things like, "You get insurance for that? You got parents' permission slips? Do we have serial numbers of all your equipment so that in case something is stolen, it gets covered by church insurance?" I just think, oh, Max, why are you you're just not spiritual enough. Why don't you trust Jesus that this is going to all be fine? I've got to call all these people, and I've got to open up all my guitar cases, and I've got to find all these numbers and the brand name. I'm sorry, I was 20 years old. I repent of this. And so we did that, and I called the guitarist that was working with us, and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry to make you do this. Could you open your guitar case and give me your guitar brand name and model and serial number?" I mean, this is a terrible, terrible thing to have to ask, right? And all my amplifier numbers and the brand names of the amplifiers, and they got it all listed on the church insurance. Well, we took the singing group over to the state fair in the fall of 1974, and we sang at the Crossroads Chapel. And that night we got home probably 11 o'clock, and we had church the next day, and we were all tired, and one of the guys said, "Well, let's just park in front of my house. I got 2 watchdogs, and we'll just park the trailer up against it, and I'm sure we won't have any problems. There was a lock on it. Everything will be fine." Well, the next morning came out, and here the lock had been busted off of there, and I'm missing a Fender Bassman, 1965 blackface Fender Bassman, which I still miss. Now they're about $2,000, and a 1968 Fender jazz bass, and a guitar, and another amplifier, and a speaker, and another, the other guy who lost his 12-string guitar, and we were out all this equipment. And the insurance company said, "Well, we've got to pay you back list. Send us a copy of what list price is." You never pay list price for a musical instrument. You find out what list is, cut it in half, and add $25, and that's what you can probably buy it for at a music store if you dicker a little bit. But Max had set it up with the insurance. The church insurance said, "We'll pay you list price," and I ended up upgrading from a $55 guitar to a Martin, which I still have. His name is Luther Martin. It's my 12 string. Now, Max P. Schultz, Pastor Max P. Schultz, I'm not sure if Max C. Schultz, I'm sorry, Max C. Schultz, was difficult and humorless, but doggone it, he did his job well, in spite of my youthful super spirituality. Anyway, he was a sea anchor, and many other times, somebody in a church council will ask, "Do we have insurance for that? Well, what happens if the heat goes off? What's the backup for?" And when you're asking these things, that person is oftentimes the voice of God. The Holy Spirit incarnate right there, who is protecting your Chisterosis americanus, I think is the technical term, okay? When you run into somebody that's asking you all these hard questions and unspiritual, don't blow them off. The terrible thing is, now that I'm the old guy, those are the questions that I ask. Like, how are you going to cover that? What are you going to do if this is canceled? A few years ago, I won't give too many details, but there was a young couple that came in. They didn't have any connection to church, but the young guy, his father was the church council president of a little town up in Wisconsin, and he called me and he said, "You live down this area. Would you be willing to marry my son and his girlfriend?" And she was completely unchurched ever, and she was hostile, very hostile. Anything I'd say, they would, she was just, and I was just being really nice, and I was really nice with them and so forth. And they had set it up, their wedding, for the first weekend in September, and it was going to be at a lake out west of Minneapolis, Lake Independence, and it was going to be on the east side of the lake. And I said, "Well, now, okay, this should be a beautiful wedding, but now, have you thought about a backup in case of rain? Do you have a weather backup? It's not going to rain. It's going to be very nice." I said, "Well, okay, I'm not trying to make anybody spend money or anything, but you might want to talk to, there's a beautiful church just on the other side of that lake. A friend of mine actually is a pastor there. It wouldn't, I don't think reserving it would cost you anything, but it would give you a backup in case nope, it's going to be very nice. I don't want to do that." Okay. And, I brought it up maybe once again, and she got even more hostile. Okay. Well, we get to the day of the wedding, and it's about 35 degrees with about a 40-mile-an-hour wind coming across this white-capped lake. And they're going to have the service down on the shore, and I'm supposed to play guitar. This was the shortest wedding anybody has ever been to. And after about the first 30 seconds playing guitar, I kind of reinvented Western tonality, and my hands were kind of... Anyway, and they had a three-sided tent for their pig roast, and the tent was set up in such a way that the sides were blowing up at about 45 degrees. And the girls were all in spaghetti strap dresses with no shawls or anything, and I think the reception was done in about a half an hour. And I felt very badly, and of course I didn't say anything. Now, that wasn't it was ministry, but again, it's when you're in a position, if somebody asks you a difficult question about the situation you're in building ministry on your board, if God gives you one of those people in the group that you're on, don't reject them or go, because they're asking you the hard questions, okay? And that's really, when you're young, that's one of the hardest things, because, but you got to have that stuff, okay? You need to, people who have had more ministry experience or experience in a different part of life may be able to approach things with a different view. You talk about your Myers-Briggs gifting. You get a down-to-earth ISTJ, ESTJ, ESFJ, and they will see things from a different place than you, who are maybe the entrepreneurial type and big picture type, and the person say, you know, have you got name tags for this? Did you order sandwiches? Have you double checked? You know, details, you know. And again, those are the sea anchors that God gives us to keep us straight when things are going badly. You know, nobody needs a church constitution until there's a problem. And that will, you know, that will keep the congregation going in the midst of the storm. Same thing is true of little things like insurance, etc. All right. So we've talked about the God thing, the gospel proclamation. And we've talked about something about the human needs and the human aspect. And now we're going to go on. We're going to turn onto this relationships, the last part of the section. And we're going to be seeing relationships. In ministry, you've got to keep relationships going with a whole bunch of different groups. And those of you who work for Crew, you know that. You're building relationships all the time. You've got the target population, you've got your co-leaders and maybe a board, you've got your co-workers that need leadership, and you've got the community at large, you've got neighborhood-wide, you've got city-wide, and you've got donors and prayer support people. And all of those people probably take a different form of communication. And in the last 10 years, a lot of the ways we've always done it are gone. It simply don't work anymore because they don't exist. There's no Christian Chronicle. You can't get any local announcements on any of the Christian radio stations except KKMS, you know, which 6 people listen to, and they've got strings and tin cans. And I'm sorry to say that because they're nice people, but, you know, I've done some drive time shows down there and offered to give away an $80 prize and nobody calls in. All right, and the local church community. All right, these are the people we're going to talk about next. Your partner churches. Is there no end to this list? Well, okay, you got that all filled out? All right. So let's talk about the target population. These are the people you're doing ministry to. And these are the people that you're going to learn to communicate with. There may be language problems. There may be trust problems. There may be the challenge that they work nights. They may be hostile towards you. They may be very afraid of you. When the Somalis went to the camps in Kenya, the Wahhabis, the radicals from Saudi Arabia, came down and evangelized the Somalis. The Somalis were very moderate, very nominal Muslims. They were Muslims who were, well, more animists, really, than anything, and they had a lot of other tribal beliefs and so forth. And they got into these camps in the midst of all this pain and stuff, and the Wahhabis came in. These are the super radical Sunnis, and they taught them about a lot of stuff. You're going to America? Well, then you need to learn about Christianity. Well, the books they've got, you can go to the Bible, or the Quran bookstore over at the Somali Mall of America, or the Somali Mall over on 26th. And you buy their books, the books that are on Christianity, grossly inaccurate as to what Christianity teaches. Written by people that have very little understanding. Probably about as much understanding about Christianity as I have about Islam, but I wouldn't write a book about it. So they were taught all sorts of things about the church. I mean, kids would come and the door would be open and they'd look in the door, afraid that they were going to be, you know, kidnapped or eaten or something. I don't know. But there was a great deal of fear. We also had a lot of rocks coming through windows 15 years ago. Anyway, and I don't know if it was them, but there was a whole new group of Somali kids in the neighborhood at that point, and our neighbor landscaped with rocks. We lost 5 windows the first night. Anyway, so the focus of the target population, is the whole focus of our Unreached People Group project, which is that's the whole next semester, is to learn about your target population. Any missionary going out wouldn't think about going out to Pango Pango until he studied Pango Pango, right? And much of what a missionary does once they get on the field, having had a lot of training, having learned the language, having learned as much as they can about the customs, having learned from other missionaries, they'll still spend several years learning the community, building the relationships, building trust, and so forth. If you go out doing ministry without learning and listening first, that's why God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. Okay? This is incredibly important, but a lot of people they just read what somebody else says or what somebody else did, and they jump in to do ministry. Not that you can't do good ministry and the Holy Spirit can't speak through you, yes. It worked with Balaam's donkey. But at the same time, if you're going to be effective in ministry, you need to do your homework. You need to study. You need to wrestle with this stuff. These are people who are just as complex as you are, and they are people who see many parts of reality 180 degrees differently than what you do. And this is the world we're heading into. This is the world we're in, and it's not going to get any less complicated. One thing you can do is use need as a channel for relationship. Now, have you ever heard the term rice Christian? The idea of rice Christian was that missionaries sometimes went out and they got rice and they fed the people, and if you were part of the church, you got free rice. And so people would come to the church because they could get free rice. Our purpose in helping somebody is not as a giveaway. I mean, it can build a relationship. But we're not doing this with an ulterior motive that, okay, we're going to come here with rice or hot dogs or whatever it might be, just so we can convert you and chalk up put a few more souls in the basket, of these are the ones I convert. No. But legitimate need, like we call divine desperation in the Cho Church and so on, when people have needs, something somewhere is screwed up. There's more than enough food for everybody on this earth, and yet 1 billion people are hungry tonight. There's enough food. We're paying people not to raise food. But if we dump the food in a foreign country, it destroys the farmers there. What do we do? How do we do this? How do we make it? Well, this is the challenge. How do you help people without creating dependency? After 30 years in this neighborhood, I don't know. These are the challenges. But as you look at people's needs, as you serve them, as you love them, when my son was with YWAM down in Colombia a few years ago, they did some work on an island out off of the coast a few miles. And there was an independent missionary down there, young guy, and he simply dug and installed cesspools for people free. They really didn't even have outhouses. And he would find ways for them to get a free toilet, and they had water in their houses, I guess. And he would dig cesspools, septic tanks, cesspools, and run some plastic pipe to them. And he was there and he served them. And he was building a bunch of believers because people couldn't believe that anybody would love them that much. Now, that was a very specific ministry, and he was called to it. I don't think you're all called to go dig cesspools. Might be. I don't know. But anytime there's a need, and we'll talk about this at the beginning of next semester, anytime there's a human need, I'll say virtually every time there's a human need, it's because somebody else is breaking God's law somewhere. somebody in selfishness has set up the system so that assets and resources aren't getting to the people of that place. Now, I'm not talking pro-socialism here, but I'm saying in a system where everybody wants to work and wants to eat that day, everybody has labor that they can trade to somebody for enough to fill the hole in the front. But when there are things in the system which skew the system, billions of dollars have been poured into Haiti. And this has happened for decades and decades and decades. And yet there's something in the system that the system keeps driving people into more and more poverty. And a handful of people get incredibly rich and resources disappear. And I don't know what's going on down there. I'm not an expert on Haiti. But because of some of the brokenness in the system is destroying the people. And human systems do that. And that's part of the dark side of human reality, is that you've got, we've got the Holy Trinity. What's the Holy Trinity? Okay, anybody know what the unholy Trinity is? Bingo. Okay, what's the world? Or what's the flesh? Okay. And what's the devil? That's pretty easy, isn't it? Okay. What's the world? All the man-made systems. And there's some wonderful things. I mean, we've got the most wonderful health care in the world. And we've got a great health care system, but it kills the doctors. We take lead out of gasoline. Yay. We put an MBPTE, I think it's called. It's more toxic than lead. Every system, okay, for example, after all the pain of the Great Depression, they created a system called AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children. And the idea was, okay, especially after the war, with women not having, being widowed, and with after seeing men desert their families in the Depression, let's have a baseline livable income so moms can stay home and raise kids, and kids can have a parent at home. Sound good? And if a guy comes into the family, well, then he shoulders that responsibility, and they become a couple, and then everything's fine, and that will take care of it. That's what the idea was. And we don't want people to make too much money on this, because but enough to live on. By the way, the amount of support in real dollars today is well, not in real dollars, not in adjusted dollars, but people are basically getting the same dollar for dollar, the same amount of income today as they did in the early 1970s. So the income in government support of that nature, it's got a different name now, has gone way downhill. There's a lot of reasons for that and so forth. But that's what it was created for, and many people were helped, and it was a great program. And I don't think kids should be living in dire poverty. We don't want to go back to the days of Dickens and Oliver Twist and so forth. Now, Murphy's Law being what it is, anytime there's a human system, then there'll be the backside of the human system. And so a certain number of teenagers, a certain number of young women heard it this way. Well, you're not really getting along with your mom and you really don't like school. All you need to do is get pregnant, and then we'll give you a free apartment and free money. And you won't be under your mom's thumb anymore. Okay, and you'll have a nice baby to play with. Now, they didn't say there's never going to be enough income for you. But anyway, so teenagers, had babies, and it wasn't a big deal. And then Oh, by the way, you can never have a man in your life stably, because if you get married, you lose everything. You lose your medical, you lose your food stamps, you lose your AFDC, you lose everything as soon as as soon as somebody comes into your life and you get married. Also, if you go to work and you make a nickel, you lose everything for a couple months. You lose your housing voucher, Section 8, you lose AFDC, you lose everything. Boom. You are now, I was just shocked. A young woman came to me, used to live across the street from us, and she was a suburban young lady, and she seemed to have something on the ball, and she had a tiny baby, probably 1 year old, and she said, I just can't stand living on AFDC anymore. I'm living in as cheap a housing as I can, and I just can't make ends meet. The month comes, and I just run out of money about, long before the month ends. And she said, I've got to get a job. Well, I called the people that now run Jericho Road, and I said, what do I tell her? Well, where does she start? And they said, tell her, first of all, don't do anything rash, because unless she can pop the clutch, now this is 1988 money, unless she can pop the clutch on a $10 an hour full-time job with full benefits, she cannot afford to get off of AFDC because she'll lose everything. Full-time job with full-time benefits. How many of those do you get? And entry-level jobs, back then you were working at McDonald's for $7 an hour. Well, today that would probably be $20. Now, one of the big changes of the welfare program is that today we have some ramps out of it. And we'll talk some more about that at other times. But this system of the world where we created something to be compassionate turns around and bites us. And the same thing is going to be, all ministry will have aspects of that. Everything we try to set up to work right and to do things, that's what the brokenness of the world is about, and you're going to run into that. God is still greater than that, but that's where we need tremendous wisdom and so forth. So need is there, and need is universal. Jesus says, the poor you will always have with you. That's been interpreted a lot of different ways, but the poor are still here. And oftentimes God brings revival to the church through poor. Let's see, is this the end of this one? Okay. When you work with people, it's important that you work to develop an egalitarian relationship with them, with respect, deep respect. If you are always, if you're here and they're here, you're never going to build a church. You need to be working that people that you're working with are making decisions. You're helping them learn to run ministry. Work towards, these are not people you do ministry to, these are people you do ministry with. Does that make sense? Especially in the midst of poverty. You have people that may be working with all kinds of social workers, all kinds of programs, and there's a certain number of people who just go from crisis to crisis to crisis to crisis. And some social worker somewhere parents them. Now, we're never going to help to get people out of that mindset in deep poverty unless we help to teach people to what it means to make their own decisions and so forth, okay? Sidebar. I think there are several groups. I think there's 4 groups of people that we're going to have to take care of. I have friends who are quite the ways right of me, people who are libertarians and so forth, and they say, well, we should cut off all welfare. The church should handle all welfare. That one I love. We've got 18,000 people in this neighborhood. Probably 70% of them need some kind of governmental support to exist. And if you do the numbers and figure that, how many tens of millions of dollars does that take every year, just to deal, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars to deal with these people and the needs around them, those who have difficulties, kids and so forth and so on. And this should all be the church. I said, You know, we barely pay our bills. How is your church going to come up with $10 million next year to help us with these kids? No, since the very beginning, this is the part of the job of community. This is what a community does. I mean, back even in Luther's time, they had a community chest. They brought grain in. You know, I mean, in the Old Testament, they came and they brought grain in, and the government divvied it up. Now, that was more of a theocratic sort of situation. I think there are four groups. There are people who are so mentally ill. I won't use the street terms. I could say crazy, but they're so mentally ill that they will never be able to take care of themselves. Second group, there is a certain percentage of our population who simply are not intelligent enough to be able to take care of themselves. And, you know, an IQ of 80, 85, people can be trained, and so, but they're going to need some kind of support. And there are people much lower than that. If you have median IQ of 100, that means for every person that's up at 110, 120, 130, you've got somebody who's 90, 80, 70 as well. And there's a certain number of people who, they can't just grow a little garden, and their family can't take care of them and give them a little bit of support, because we don't have those systems anymore. We don't have those structures, and a lot of them end up in the city because there are group homes, there are resources here. Okay, and the third group are people who are just so chemically dependent that they're ruined. They've been ruined by chemicals. So you've got mentally ill, you've got mentally handicapped, mentally challenged. You've got people who are chemically dependent, and they're so ruined by chemicals. And I've known people who finally hit sobriety after 30 times through treatment. But there's a lot of people who just, they just have an alcohol deficiency in their brain chemistry, is basically what it works out to, and they can't function without that, and there are some people that just never ever can sustain sobriety, and whatever. By the way, one of the interesting things is that I've been suggesting this for a long time, is that a lot of chemical dependency, a lot of alcoholism especially, and other drugs too, is self-medicating, as I said earlier. Well, dual diagnosis is now the hot thing in chemical dependency, realizing that you've got people who might have a personality disorder or underlying depression or mental illness, that they're treating themselves, and that's what the problem is. That's what gets them into this. So that's kind of the cutting edge, as I understand it. Okay, fourth one is people that have just been raised in so much chaos that they never get above the chaos. And I don't know what you call that, but these are people who just, they go from chaos to chaos to chaos, and the family or the community or the social worker or the school or whatever, they're constantly needing help because they've just always lived in chaos. Now, they may be mentally ill, they may be one of the other ones above, but they lived so many generations in this chaos that they never break out of it. And I don't know what the answer is there. We almost need something like residential programs for people, retraining them like that. So let's take a little break here, and we'll come back for more thrills, chills, and excitement. There's lots of goodies back there. I'll race you. Test. Oh, it's on. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I've always been very sensitive to caffeine. But I thought I had outsmarted things with it. I like mochas, and I stopped over at one of the coffee houses and I ordered a decaf mocha. Well, the chocolate had plenty of caffeine in it. Wide awake, bushy-tailed. Not the next morning. What kind of company do you work for? Oh, is this Crew? Oh, it's Crew. People bring stuff like that to Crew? Okay, well, I'm sorry, I knew that.
Landlord and friends of the ministry.
Well, I covered your prayers. Well, a bunch of things if you'll pray for. My son and daughter-in-law have twins coming, and the twins are supposed to be here by around the 15th of February, but they have a tendency to come a little earlier, I guess. So please keep those babies in your prayer. They are so far named A and B, and A is female, B is a boy, and they just happen to be, that's how they're lined up. And they've been trying to have babies for 14 years. They adopted one, and this had a little medical help behind it, a lot of medical help. Anyway, that's one. Number two, my doctor friend down in Phoenix is still very sick and getting worse, and he was not able to stand double immunotherapy. He wasn't able to stand single immunotherapy. Then they started him on chemotherapy, and he wasn't able to sustain the chemotherapy either. So right now he's got no therapy. And I mean, that gives him, he has advanced kidney cancer, and it's all over the place. 66 years old, thought he was perfectly healthy. One night he wasn't feeling well at work, and they did blood tests, and here his kidney function was way off, and gave him an MRI. He had just had surgery a few months before, and nothing was visible then. And he's got cancer all over the place. And this guy is about as close as I've got to a brother, Dr. Bob Nimlas. And then finally, the book that's based on this course, The Whole World Has Changed and the Church is Asleep, it's been off at a publisher since Labor Day. And they're going to make their decision whether they're going to publish or not by Christmas. If they were, this would really help our movement. And anyway, please pray about that. Now, as I said last week, this semester ends the third week in January. Now, some of the students, because they have these classes in other places and because they're gone in January, won't be here for this. But that is part of your semester, the next 3 weeks, and or the 7th, 14th, and the 21st. And you're going to have some really great presenters on Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. And these realities, these religions, you got to realize the Eastern religions have an entirely different sense of what is real. And the Buddhists and Hindus are much more like well, Christian Science gets mixed in there. What is, reality isn't real. Buddhism, that your goal is to become nothing. Which is kind of eternal death, and yet it has very little to say to the real world, because if you're trying to make a living and become wealthy and take care of your family, and yet your purpose is to become nothing, It's just, but yet it's. Well, pantheism kind of falls into where Hinduism was created, came out of. But they have different sources will say 88 million gods, 300 million gods. Probably they've got an infinite number of gods.
How do you define a god in that system? How do you define a god in this? How does that number? What's the bar that this is a god because of this?
I don't know. This is not my area of expertise. And I'm not sure exactly where that's at. I mean, they've got major gods, and but you know, I don't know. Of course, and if you go far enough, I think you can become kind of like in Mormonism. You can become a god, but that's a whole other deal. So if that will be very fruitful, and that will be the end of. That's the fourth unit of this semester.
The speakers that are coming, are they actually practicing those faiths
No.
now?
Well, what?
Believers now?
Yes, the Muslim guy is Pastor John Spalding, who actually is a member of this church and is on our church council and is actually called through this church to his ministry, Christians meeting Muslims. He teaches in some of the colleges around the area. He has a master's in Islam seminary, John Spalding, and very good guy. He's a few years older than I am. Was a missionary in Senegal for about 13 years. Brilliant man. He went to college at was it Princeton, one of the Ivy League schools. Anyway. Princeton or Harvard, one of the two. I get mixed up. But anyway, a very fine, very dedicated guy who's really loves Jesus, and he's just solid as can be. He's quiet, and he's kind of introverted, scholarly kind of guy, but wonderful human being. I think that's January 7th. Yeah. No, that's this. You're off until we won't see it till next year, and then the 14th. I don't know if it's Hinduism first and then Buddhism or vice versa. That'll be it.
On the spreadsheet you give us, it says Buddhism and Shintoism.
Yeah. Taoism. And that's all going to be the that's John Easterling, who teaches at he's a religion professor, missions professor at Northwestern. Really good guy. And his daughter, he'll tell you, who is kind of a little mentally handicapped, has some learning disabilities, got very fooled and ended up running off, eloping, and marrying a Hindu guy. And John learned more about Hinduism than he ever wanted to, or how marriage works in the Hindu world. Anyway, so then we come back and we start talking about these challenges in the city, and we start doing this project where we're going to do, in little bite-sized bits, we're going to learn about our people groups. And we'll be coming and learning this stuff. Now, we will be having some new students joining us. You can start this second semester. So we'll have a couple of students joining us, and we will be helping to catch them up. I will be meeting with this some ahead of time. But you also, I hope, will be helping to share some of the insights that you've learned so far. And I hope that you guys will come back and be with us second semester. There's no gun to your head, but you will find that by the time you get about 2/3 the way through second semester, all of a sudden a bunch of stuff is going to click, and the pieces are going to come together. My wife loves to decorate for holidays, and so like with Thanksgiving, she starts putting out tablecloths and placemats, and starts putting everything out like 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. And the table's just beautiful. Everything is just gorgeous, and they've got the glassware and all the other antique things and all the different family things and so on. And I get the cooking job, and I do the shopping for that and put things together. I had a dad who was in hotel work, so I learned how to cook. And there's all this preparation, and then finally, boom, you have the meal. Everybody talks about what they're thankful for that year, and there's 20-some people in the room, and it's all the in-laws and outlaws. And then the meal lasts about 45 minutes, and everybody, stuffs themselves, and then a lot of them have to excuse themselves because they've got to go to the other side of the families. But the preparation, I love doing the preparation. My wife sometimes gets a little tizzied by all of it. I just love the excitement of getting ready for something like that, and the preparation and so on, cooking and planning the meal. But the fun really comes when you get to eat it. And the fun comes when everybody gets there and so on. Well, we've been setting your table now for 12 weeks. And so we've been teaching you about culture. We've been getting you used to the city. We've been trying to teach you a little bit about how ministries work, how some of the structures work, how you put things together. Now, some of these things are big, and you don't have to build a big ministry. You may be part of one, or you may work with one. You may go into the leadership of one. But you can be just you. And in your job, or in your cubicle, or in whatever it might be that you do, or your next door neighbor, the key, if we're going to reach our new America, is going to be at the store. It's going to be in the cubicle. It's going to be in the next door neighbor, like Pastor Joel going across the street and greeting his Somali neighbor of several years, and it was the first time anybody had visited them. That's all it takes. But if we give you some information on this stuff and show you where to start and where, how to get some more, where to grow from here, that's what the purpose of this course is. We're trying to put some new ideas in your head and create a framework by which you can understand this stuff. We can't teach you everything. For 10 years, we ran something called U4C, which was an entire bachelor's degree. The kids came down and lived here for a whole school year. And we had in-depth classes on all these different areas. But we couldn't sustain that. And frankly, when somebody came out with $30,000, $40,000 in college loans, and we expect them to be able to go to work in a poverty situation where they might be making $20,000 a year, it was a model that was not sustainable. And I could tell you other stories. It was a great run. We had 40 people come through the major, and it was a life-changing time, and we had a lot of fun. But we've got to come up with other models, and it comes up, if it's going to work, it's going to be the normal person in the pew who we turn into a frontline missionary. Now, whether you guys from Crew are normal people or not, being you spend your whole, not that you're abnormal, mind you, but, you're missionaries already. But you're heading into a time when your entire organization is going to be, our universities and stuff, you've got a tremendous cross-cultural opportunity. And I don't know what kind of training they give you cross-culturally, but it's going to be this one-on-one stuff. So as you deal with doing ministry, avoid the gatekeeper role, that you've got free stuff, and so people come. There's a place for, passing out food and passing out, dealing with people's needs. But if you can make it in such a way that you're building relationships and that it's not just you are the grand poobah and they have to kowtow to you to get what they need. When you're learning your target population, it's going to be time intensive. Now, when you're doing this project, we're going to ask you not to spend more than an hour a week. Now, we've had people who have gotten so caught up into this thing that they started doing 10 hours a week. One guy about 10 years ago, after it was explained very carefully to him, this is a 15-week thing, got so excited, he did the entire project in 1 week. Well, we kind of had to slow him down and put wheels back on it because your group, you're way ahead of your group and so on. If you were going to study a group and put your friends together, you might spend a lot more time than that. But we want to show you what you can accomplish and learn on your own in about an hour a week. And take them, and this is one method among many. I've taught this all over the United States in workshops, and it can be tweaked a lot of different ways. But again, learn your stuff before you get into it. Even as you do ministry, keep studying the people, learning the culture, because that's so critical. All right, that didn't go. All right. Now, when you're working with people, and as you're working in an organization, these are really good cookies. You will put together a group of people to do something. If it gets far enough along that you have to have a formal structure, for example, MissionShift ran for 15 years without being a 501c3, without having any formal structure, without having a constitution, without having a treasurer. It had a committee or a board, but all the money just ran through a line budget in St. Paul's. St. Paul's treasurer cut the checks, and we didn't need insurance, we didn't need anything. Well, now we're an official 501c3, and we've got to have liability insurance, and we've got to have all kinds of stuff. And our board has bylaws, and it's got articles of incorporation and all that stuff, because at that point we needed it, because we got to the point where as we started doing things more officially, and as we started getting branches, people wanting to build branches and stuff, all of a sudden we needed a firewall. You don't need all that stuff. Form follows function. So when a handful of friends say to get together, okay, typical MissionShift product. A woman who was a Campus Crusade staffer. I'm not sure if she's still with you, and I'm going to have to stop and wrestle with the name. Maybe better if I don't. She and her husband were both on crew staff, and I don't know if they still are. I'm guessing they're probably not. And she kind of always worked in the back, opened letters, and did that kind of stuff. Very, very quiet, very introverted. Caregiver, ISFJ, not a big picture person, not a lead, never saw herself in any way as a leader. And we would sit and meet. She said, this class changed my life. She said, I never thought of myself as a leader, but we're living in this apartment building, and I noticed there were some kids across that were down the hall, and they didn't have jackets. One of our other friends lived next door. I said, hey, why don't we go over to Goodwill and buy some jackets? They look like they're about this old and that old, and they went over to Goodwill, and they paid $10 or something, and they got a couple jackets and found a couple hats and things, and brought them over that night to the family, who were from a different ethnic background. And they talked and they visited, and the mom was so thrilled to have jackets, because she hadn't been able to afford jackets for the kids, and it was late November, I think, at that point. And they built a relationship, and the mom came, brought them some ethnic food and said thank you, and they would go down and visit a little bit, and they started a Bible study with her, and they brought the kids to church, to Sunday school, and built a relationship. And then one of her friends came alongside, and also wanted to become wanted to join the Bible study, wanted to learn, because this woman was finding it so interesting to learn in simple English. Now, they didn't need a board. They didn't need anybody's permission. They just opened up their eyes, and then they opened up their lips, opened up their heart someplace in between there, and they were able to do ministry. They didn't need anybody's permission. They didn't need a structure. They didn't need a board. They didn't need a treasurer. They pulled a $5 bill out of their pocket. This is ministry, people. And this is what it's going to take. It's going to take millions of Christians in this country who have been taught and taught and taught and taught. And now it's time. They're surrounded. All they need to do is open up their mouths, open up their eyes, open up their hearts. Okay, now if you get to the point that you have a board or you're working with a group of people, from bottom up, it's the simplest to a real fancy organization. Let me just touch on this quickly. When an organization begins, it typically, and we have never gone past this with MissionShift, it's a working board. Everybody's got tasks. Everybody does stuff. They do recruitment. They do, we talk about stuff together, and we do that stuff. And then the next step up would be an advisory board, which is a decision-making board. And they're the ones that do most of the deciding. Now, there's a style of board now that in larger organizations is that this next step we'd probably call a policy board, that all the board works on is policy, and the staff takes care of making, finding ways and reports back on how they made that happen. This way you don't have your main board taking care of endless details. You've got staff for that. So you set policy and then everything runs according to policy. They're kind of a living constitution and bylaws, so to speak. Does that make sense? Much less hands-on. Most church council would be like an advisory board. Now, when you get to be big enough, we used to, across the street here, we used to have the Hennepin County Lung Association, formerly the TB, March of Dimes? No. What did they do?
March of Dimes is for babies.
Yeah. Well, this was the Hennepin, anyway, it was the tuberculosis people. And then as tuberculosis got cured, they then went into COPD and other, fibrosis. Yeah, and dealing with lung diseases and so forth. So they'd been around for 75 years, and they had a lot of support, and they very finely tuned organization, and they had a staff that was very much a paid staff, and they had a board that met a handful of times a year, maybe 3 times a year, and everything was handled by staff. They kind of looked at stuff. They probably fed them a couple good meals, and they said thank you. In fact, you might even have a glamour board and an oversight board. Poor Al Quee. Al is now 90-some years old. Wonderful human being. Very helpful for our ministry. Al must sit on more boards than a lumberyard. Because his name is so much credibility. He probably hasn't been to any board meetings in 20 years, but he's listed on the letterhead, a glamour board. You've got instant credibility if you have somebody like that on your letterhead. I was part of an organization here in the neighborhood, and their board was kind of A and B, but they had some names on there like Sharon Sells Belton, former mayor of Minneapolis, and the head of the park board, and some other people who were very well-known names, which helped with their funding, helped with their credibility in the community. And some of them I hadn't seen in a meeting in 5 years. But they still had their name on the board because, well, it's nice to have those big names. Yeah. Oh, I don't know. That's the kind of name we're talking about. Mm-hmm. When you think about it, what in the world was Billy Graham doing in Minneapolis? One of our members, the guy that's chairman of the church council right now, good friend of mine, Joel Arsvold, came up through their accounting department, and for the last 30 years it had been their chief financial officer, CFO. And he oversaw that whole $118 million or whatever it is budget. I know it's over 110. And, oversaw all that stuff and brought them through many IRS audits, which is a real pain in the neck. And they always came through completely squeaky clean. So he was part of the inner circle of the inner circle of the inner circle for years. And I was sitting at my desk one day, and I don't know what I was thinking about, but I was thinking Billy Graham, Southern Baptist, North Carolina, Minneapolis. What's going on here? And of course, we have here, the strong emphasis of back then there were some very evangelical Lutherans, there still are some. There were, the Covenant Church and the E-Free Church and the Swedish Baptist, all of whom are closet Lutherans. They have that underlying, they have the underlying sense of grace that came out of Lutheranism. Now it's been Calvinized a little bit, or maybe galvanized or something, but the idea of grace underlies their theology, and they're very grace oriented. They're as organizations, that's part of their DNA. And so I was thinking about this, and I called Joel up one afternoon. I said, "Joel, you got a minute?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Hey, when Billy Graham put his organization in Minneapolis, was he consciously trying to create evangelicalism by crossbreeding Southern Baptist with Scandinavian pietists?" He said, "Where'd you read that?" I said, "I didn't read it, I just thunk it up." And he said, "Yeah, that was a conscious decision." Chicago also, of course, had the big E-Free and Covenant relationships, but Minneapolis had a lot of the Scandinavian pietists, which is a good fit. Much of the same beliefs, but that emphasis on grace, which was very different, and in the power of God's Word, as over against some of the Arminian stuff and so on. It was a conscious decision, which, by doing that cross-pollinization, ended up creating American evangelicalism. That was a conscious decision. Isn't that fascinating? By taking the two very different historically theologies, if you will, and getting them to talk with each other to create a new axis, if you will, in American religious history. So anyway, speaking about being on a lot of boards, he's been on a lot of boards too. Right now I'm on only our board, so which is good. For a while there I was on way too many, but okay. So your relationship anyway with your leaders, you want to stop and think, if you end up at the point with a board, what are you expecting this board to do? If you have documents, what do they say the board needs to do? I was at a presentation, a day-long thing on training your board and getting your board working well and so forth. And it was a great presentation. There were all kinds of nonprofit organizations, not just church thingies, but all kinds of big things. We've got the richest nonprofit concentration in the Twin Cities of any place in the United States. And we came to the end, and I said, "Well, this has been a great presentation." I said, "But as you're training your board, I didn't see anything in here about teaching them your DNA and what you started out to do and understanding your history so they understand what their target was." And the woman stopped. She said, "Oh." She said, "We didn't think about that, but yeah, that's really, really important." This is one of the reasons when you're bringing new board members on, you really need to teach them a little bit about what you set out to do, because then you get continuity. For a long time, we only had board members who had been students of MissionShift Institute. And today we've got a bunch of people on board that have not been. And sometimes that's difficult because they haven't been through the class. So anyway, boards are interesting, and they aren't all created equally. And of course, like in church boards, you can have 30 congregations with the same constitution, and they all work differently. So I won't go further into that. Okay, so relationships with your coworkers. The leader ends up being kind of the hub, ends up being the switchboard, ends up being the communicator and the connector. And a person that's going to be leading something, whether it's just 4 or 5 people buying coats for kids, or if you end up with a committee at your church, or you end up with a task force, or you end up whatever, a leader, the key thing that the leader does is communicate the vision. What did you set out to do? If everybody's clear on that, it's really good. It really helps to not get bogged down. A lot of times you end up getting bogged down in the stuff of the moment or conflict, and so if you're all facing the same direction, all knowing you're going there, and that's what you got to get done, people don't have time to fuss and fight and fume. This congregation made it through 30 years with very, very little conflict. And most of that was because we were just so busy with what had to be done at the moment, we knew we didn't have time to waste on conflict. And try to teach people to talk, and, we're headed that way. What do we need to do to get that done? And if you get bogged down in other stuff, then you end up fussing and fighting and feuding. But if people know what they're set out to do, stay on the task, train new workers so that they understand the task and get to know each other and build relationships, have some fun. We've always said that on the MissionShift board, there's one requirement: the person has to be a fun person. And we laugh a lot. We joke around, but we get stuff done. I've been here 24 years now. So it's important to transmit, as I said, the organizational DNA. What's the history? What's the vision? What you set out to do? And if they know the history, again, that helps to draw that red thread out so they know where they're going. Questions? What do you think? What kinds of things do you think I mean by organizational DNA? Pardon?
Continuity or unity.
Okay, continuity and unity, okay.
Making sure people have a similar vision.
Okay.
Making sure people know what you're set out to do when you bring them on.
Okay, good. Other thoughts? What's else on DNA? Values, very important. If you've got the same values, you're probably going to end up going the same direction. The history of successes and also failures. It's important to know what didn't work and how you got screwed up and why you got screwed up. Okay, let me move ahead here. Now, as a leader, one of the great dangers is being so far in front of the troops that you start looking like the enemy. Pastors sometimes will get a vision and they don't communicate it with the congregation, and they get going on something and they don't have the buy-in by the leaders, they don't have the buy-in by the congregation, they don't understand what's going on, and you get so far out in front of the troops that you start looking like the enemy. So it's important that the people who are with you and you're with them. What did we set out to accomplish? And talk about it so people understand what they're doing, because they don't necessarily all get that. We talked about this before. Yonggi Cho says, find the faithfulness and then train for the task. It's wonderful to have gifted people, but faithful people will learn to walk through fire if they and will learn any task simply because they've got the faithfulness and the stick-to-itiveness, the tenacity to make it happen. All right. Now, who do you have to communicate with in the community at large? Now, we're not talking about the community at large, meaning primarily your clients or the people you're targeting, but it's important that your neighborhood Testing. Okay. The neighborhood and the people you're working around need to be on your side. They need to know what your ministry is about. If you're not talking about what you're doing and you've got troubled people coming in and people don't know who you are, and if you haven't met them, if you haven't gone around and introduced yourself to your neighbors and stuff, they'll invent stuff. And the first time that there's a car parked in front of their driveway the wrong way, or somebody, it's important that your neighborhood area knows who you are and what you're trying to do. So you need to be communicating in neighborhood meetings. You need to be communicating with neighborhood churches. You need to have that visibility so people know what you're doing. And then also people will help you. They will jump on board, or they'll send you people or send you stuff or whatever. You need to have visibility, and that's hard to do. People's attention span is very, very short. Citywide, it's getting very hard to communicate with the greater city. We got all these new tools, but back when it was we had a Christian evangelical newspaper, we had a Lutheran newspaper in this town. KTIS used to do a lot of announcements of events and so forth. CCO used to do announcements of events, of all kinds of stuff going on in the community. The newspapers actually had enough advertising so they could afford to publicize events going on. Every page has to have X percentage average of advertisement, except for maybe the front page. And if they don't have enough advertisement that day, news gets thrown away. They don't publicize it, and they don't have the news collecting ability they used to have, because if you sit down with your newspaper tomorrow morning, if you still get a newspaper, go through it and figure out whose press release was the basis of that article. On most mornings in both of our papers in town here, a lot of the articles, the majority of the articles, came out of a press release from this governmental office or from this organization or from this company or whatever. The news gathering ability of really finding out what's going on, investigative, it doesn't exist anymore. We are so impoverished of information, and yet we've got all this, we've started to try to use Facebook for our stuff, and so far, I don't know that it's been. Did anybody here sign up because you saw a Facebook ad? That was a few $100 wasted. It's hard. I used to teach classes on how to communicate with the Twin Cities, how to do press releases, and where to send them to and stuff. I haven't seen a press release of mine printed. After doing it for years, I haven't had a press release pop in several years. Because you can't send it to you can't fax it into the newsroom anymore. Now you got to try to send it to individual reporters, and I don't think they ever look at those boxes. It's a very challenging thing as to how to communicate citywide. Events are probably one of the best things. Okay, donors. The people that support you, either with funds or with prayer support, which are often the same people. And some people will go from being prayer supporters to donors, and some will go from being donors to prayer supporters. You communicate. I may have mentioned before when I've taught communication out at Bethany College of Missions, I said, you people have to think of yourself like the Roman character Janus. Janus was a character with two faces, one that faced forward and one that faced backwards, like all teachers have. And that's where we get the word January from. Janus looked forward to the new year and also back at the old one, because that's what January does, kind of when the year changes. You have two mission fields. One mission field are the people there in Pango or wherever that you're reaching with the gospel, but you also are nurturing and discipling a group of people at home. You're teaching them how to pray. You are teaching them you become a priority of their life. Maybe they've got just a normal job and they can't go off and do this full time, but you are teaching them what ministry is about. and you are doing ministry on their behalf. And they need to know what you're doing, and they need to be praying for you, and they need to be involved because you're a big part of their life. And so you need to communicate with both. Now, you don't say the same thing to the people in Pango Pango that you say with your people at home, but both you've got to think of in terms of discipleship. Do you guys talk about this when you're dealing with your supporters and so forth, that it's an aspect of discipling them?
Especially with the kind of conversations we have in our ministry, where members come from, so a lot of times we can nudge them.
Okay, disciple them, encourage them, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. By the way, for most missionaries, this is just like, huh? It just wasn't, they didn't think that way about the importance of that ministry. A time when the church is so weak, and most people in our culture would say, a missionary, are you out of your mind? You're teaching them what Christianity is about. Especially if you've got, anybody under 35 and this is new to them. This is very countercultural. And it's, you're teaching them what's basic Christianity. So, okay. Keep a list of your needs. It's been very interesting. Many times when we have been aware of and made, if nothing more, a mental list of, boy, what do we like to have next? God has dropped it out of the sky. I think I told you the story about the video projector. No, okay, no, that's, in 2002, I went to the first ethnic summit, and Elaine, who wrote the book, if this rings a bell, stop me. Patty Lane had this beautiful little projector. It was this big, just, I'd never seen anything like it. I was lugging around a 15-pound HP, and this little tiny projector was so cool. And I came back to the church council. I knew we didn't have any money for it. I did some checking. They listed out about $2,800, between $2,800 and $3,000, someplace up in there. And I talked to somebody, and they said, well, I'll tell you what, you're a nonprofit, you're in an urban setting. We'll sell it to you for $2,000 bucks. By the way, you can buy one now for probably $300. So I went to the church council a week or so later, and I said, if God drops $2,000 out of the sky, can I get a video projector? My covet bone is going crazy. This would be so nice. It would be so handy. Well, I could hear the eyes roll, and they said, sure, Pastor. I said, can we get a motion to that effect? Always get a motion to that effect. And that, if $2,000 drops out of the sky, you can go get your projector. Didn't think anything more of it. And a couple months later, a pastor, friendly acquaintance type, guy I know pretty well, showed up at my door unannounced, pastor of a pretty good-sized church, and he had never been in my office before or since. Shows up at the door one day, he said, can we talk for a minute? I said, well, sure, come on in, Todd. He said, this year we were blessed. We ended up with more money than we needed. And so we were choosing a handful of congregations we would like to bless. What could you use $2,000 for? Not $1,900, not $1,500, not $2,300. What could you use $2,000 for? I said, funny you should ask. And I brought it to church council, and they laughed, and they said, sure, Pastor, you can go get your projector. Have a list of what you need, articulate it, begin to pray for it. God will provide. God will provide. He's dropped millions of dollars on this place right when we needed it. He's brought us, all of our three major donors that have dumped this money on us, sometimes $150,000 at a time, or $300,000 at a time, but buying a house and stuff and rehabbing it. They came to us. They heard about us, got excited about us. They came to us. Can't make this stuff up. It's weird. God has the cattle on 1,000 hills. Have you seen the price of beef? All right. There's various, okay, you have not because you ask not, the Bible says. Ask. Don't be afraid to ask. Keep that list. that you don't need to obsess about. Your Father knows about it, but bring it out there so that you can learn the Father's nature. He loves blessing you. Various levels of commitment. You know, some people will commit for $100 a month. We've got a guy, retired stockbroker, and he came to a presentation we gave a few years ago, and for 20 years he has dropped $100 a month. We can set the clocks by it into the ministry here. Now, he hasn't dropped $300,000, but 25 years times $1,200 a month, you know, that's nice to have. I still consider that real money. And we've got a nice relationship and so forth, but you know, that's God's work. And is $100 a month, is that on par with $300,000? Well, it's maybe not as showy, but like I said, it's there. Now, this is a group you minister to. You are their ministry. Maybe they, maybe they're in sales, maybe they're computers, and then they pray for you and they care about you, but you're the one that's their hands and feet. There are differing gifts. Now, this is a very important thing that may seem very silly, and maybe you do this all the time. But the old-fashioned thing of a thank you note is incredibly effective. Go out and buy, you can make thank you notes. Just, with your word processor, take a sheet of paper and fold it in quarters and make a nice little thing out of it. And then, draw the picture of what you're going to have, whatever it's going to be. And so you can see, because it's upside down now over here and it's in the upper right quadrant. And just sit, for nothing. You can go buy quarter sheet of paper envelopes at the drugstore. And for probably a penny a sheet, you can make a very lovely thank you note that's personalized, that you can, write on. Don't do it with your computer. Write by hand. Now, for me, that means I have to draw the letters if I want anybody able to read it. But you start out with something like this, and of course, if you've got, say you've got a church on the top here, Okay, so here's the. Oh, no. Let's put a smiley face on the front. Okay, so there's your smiley face on the front. Where is that on your sheet of paper? Oh, he's over here on the right-hand side. Okay, was on upside down. If you put other stuff, it might have to be. But anyway, you can make this out of a sheet of paper, and then you just have these in your desk. And when somebody does something nice to you, just write 3 sentences. If you ever go for a job interview, stick a stamp on the envelope. You can have it addressed and, say thank you for the job interview, and it's nice hearing about your family today, so they know that it's something that you wrote up afterwards. And then immediately, as you go around the corner, drop it in a mailbox. People don't do that. I would go to our members' houses. Somebody does something nice or something, out of the way, fixes a door or something. Send them a thank you note. 5 years later, I would come to their house and it was still stuck on their refrigerator. And it wasn't that they'd taken it out and refound it and put it out because I was coming that day. No, it's just something that it was so out of the ordinary. As you work with people, as they do nice things to you, a handwritten thank you note, which takes seconds to do, is one of the most effective things even today. Not an email, not even a phone call, but a stupid written thank you note impresses people. That makes sense? Yeah. Because it's an unknown thing. You don't have to be fancy. If you've got nice penmanship, it's even more wonderful. But just and do it in some kind of ink. You do it in blue ink, or guys, you probably don't want to use pink ink or something, or purple. But do it so it's obvious that it's not printed on a printer, on a normal. This isn't just something you ran off on your whatever. Okay. And you put something in there personal so they know it's not a form thing, but that's easily done, okay? Any communication, when you're working with people, to thank them. We've got people that haven't donated anything, some of these big donors that haven't donated anything in 10 years. And we still send them a nice Christmas card, and some of them we send a gift certificate for $150 for a nice meal out every year, just as a thank you note. We haven't forgotten you. We haven't forgotten you. Now, I don't know if that's smart or whether it's right or what, but that's what we do. We don't want to forget our friends. So, and I don't really know anything about fundraising. I've never had I guess I've attended a couple workshops on fundraising. But there's no well system on fundraising. You just tell the vision. You just tell the story. Tell what God is doing and tell what needs to be done. And the people who are the visionary entrepreneurs, the people who get it, will get it. And they'll get excited. Tell a vision. Tell the vision. Where there's no vision, it's a Lutheran parish. Okay, it's an old joke. Okay, talking about the local church community. The American church is collapsing. Now, I guess there was an article this week about hope, some stuff going on in the Twin Cities, and but right now, frankly, the American church is the weakest it's been probably since 2 generations after the Pilgrims. The next generation was the Great Awakening. First Great Awakening. The churches don't have enough Sunday school teachers. They don't have enough income. They don't have enough anything. So maybe some of the churches will have the ability, if they get a hold of your idea and you can communicate it, it may work well. But they're not the sources of funding or of volunteers that they were 20 years ago. Now, that's very sad. The city churches and the small churches are spread very, very thin. And yet, I find it's almost impossible to stay on the radar screen of megachurches. We've had some relationships with some megachurches where they would, very generously send us $100 a month, and which beats a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. But I've sat down with several mission committees at big churches and said, listen, we deeply appreciate what you're doing, and you're doing a great job. But for the sake of your church, right now you're supporting 25 different ministries, $100 a month here and $75 a month there. Your people don't have any buy-in, and believe it or not, $100 buys the same thing in the city as it does 5 miles away in the suburb. Now, I'm really a bad person. You know what you call a woman who supports herself with casual relationships with many men. What you guys should really sit down. I know you want to be nice to everybody, but instead of having casual relationships with a whole bunch of ministries, why don't you pick 3 or 4 and really build a relationship so your people become involved, your people are blessed, your people are discipled, and you really put some real muscle that those ministries need. Why don't you put $5,000 into this ministry, and it's some ministry? I don't care if it's us or not, even if this means we're cut out. But I think you want to think about that, because just because the committee wants to be nice to everybody doesn't mean that you're getting much ministry done. And at $100 a year, those organizations can't do the kind of job of communicating with you and being in contact with you that you would want them to be, where you can really have something mutually together out of each other, from each other, so that your ministry is being blessed. It looks great that you support, these 25 ministries, but you're really not accomplishing anything, and it's not nurturing your people. And whereas if they can get their hands dirty and really develop a relationship, you've got something. I've seen some cut back, yeah, and I've seen them try to organize some of their stuff. We did get cut out of one. some of the partner churches may be a good source of board members, especially if you found an agency. But what happens is you get down about 3 generations from the founding people who really had a vision and were oftentimes leaders in the congregation. You end up with the leftovers that you know, they want to keep their leaders on their committees and their boards. And so you get somebody that really doesn't have any leadership ability, doesn't have any power in the congregation, but they're available. And it's wonderful that there are people like that. But that's kind of disheartening when you go from having somebody that, say, like, one of the first members of this of our board was from a great church, and he was a medical missionary. He had a lot of the jobs in the churches over the years. He was very excited about what we were doing. And he got sick and passed away, and we went through a couple different people. And about the third person, the time we got somebody, you know, it was kind of like, well, who can we afford to give up? You know, and instead of having Joe Mauer, you had a B-string little leaguer, so to speak. So, again, don't take someone just because they can breathe and they're from a particular church, because if they're not respected and don't have power in that organization, they're not going to be good communicators of the organization and so forth. Does that make sense? Am I sounding like really too pragmatic and down tonight? I hope I don't. I'm not trying to be. But you got to think these things through. With your partner churches, communication, 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 communication. It's time consuming, and some churches, shiny object, new shiny object, shiny object. Mission pastor of a nameless megachurch that I had very, very close ties with, pastors and so forth. Hi there. The mission pastor came in, and he, even though I had intimate ties with many people, many of the leadership of that congregation, he said, well, you know, we appreciate what you're trying to do. He says, you know, and our people just don't have time to be trained. And, you know, there's this, over next 100 yards away, there's this Pentecostal church, and they're just doing all kinds of exciting stuff, and it's really visible. And, you know, we're into Blackaby, and Blackaby says, you know, go where the Holy Spirit is moving and jump on board whatever God is doing. In other words, jump on board do what everybody else is doing because it's cool. I didn't say that. I said, it's okay. They're doing some very nice, splashy things. But, you know, in 50 years, we'll still be here. And we're training people, and we're equipping people for this city. And we're working on with a 50-year horizon. You know, we're now 30 years into that 50-year horizon. And actually, if you're going to bless your people and get your people involved in what needs to be done, going down to being a part of a splashy meeting, or, you know, passing out food, or being part of a concert in a park, it's fun. But it's not Blackaby. It's fun and it's good, and what they're doing is fine, but go for the long run. Well, we're told we're supposed to do stuff that makes a splash that gets people excited. Shiny object. I don't know. Anyway, it's hard to keep the attention with something like that, because when you're dealing with something that takes a lot of slow plugging along, it isn't necessarily a shiny object. In 1991, I'd been here 3 years, and we started seeing the stuff that needed to be done in the neighborhood, and started talking about some of these things. One night in a church council meeting, one of the church council members sat back and said, well, Pastor, this is all good, and we support it. But if we're going to get this thing done, we're going to have money from outside. We're going to have support. We're going to need to have people. and we can't do it alone. I said, well, that's true. By the way, we're about half as big as we were 30 years ago. I said, I will go out and I will drum up resources. I will get money and I will get connections with congregations. But you got to promise me two things. Number one, that our budget of 1991 will remain our responsibility, and money from the outside will only do new ministry. That will be ministry paid for by those churches that will not get done if those churches aren't giving. Now, things have had to be modified a few ways since then, but I said, because if we start getting welfare, the congregation will stop giving. The congregation will say, well, we're dying. Last one out, shut off the lights. So this money is not going to become a part of our budget. We're not going to become dependent on this outside money because that's going to kill us. And number two, we're going to be a blessing. We are going to give back to these congregations more than they give to us. How are we going to do that? We don't have any money. So it's not going to be money. We're going to train them, we're going to give them opportunities, we're going to bring people in, and we're going to create a relationship with that congregation that mutually strengthens that congregation. And that kept our congregation from being destroyed. They didn't become dependent. They saw that they had a ministry. Ever hear of Leadership Journal? That's the pastor's journal connected with Christianity Today. They did an article about us about 15 years ago based on a paper that I'd written called Bridging City and Suburb, that here all these people who are suburban people were deeply committed to an urban church and were involved in a lot of hands-on ministry, but were committed, because they were suburban people, to opening up ways so they could communicate to other suburban people. So our congregation was seen as a bridge to suburban congregations that wanted to make a difference. Because that's where we were at, we decided to celebrate who we were. And it helped. And we did communicate with, a lot with suburban congregations. So, return values, you're not just another begging hand. And if you're going to communicate, you can, if you're going to deal with somebody down at the bottom, the missions pastor or whatever, that's fine. But if you're going to try to get a congregation on board, if you don't have the senior pastor's attention and support, it's not going to go anywhere. You got to shoot for the head. And that's just a sad fact. And it bugs me because sometimes our staff will try to contact a senior pastor or a head of some organization, and you can't believe the ego that's involved, respect type thing. And they can't get through. They can't get in. They can't get a phone call back. That's another thing that in the last 20 years has really changed, that people don't return phone calls. People, if somebody calls you and leaves a message, call them back. That's called... Excuse me, not that this bothers me, but that's just common courtesy. That's part of the rules of the game. Okay, sorry. But get that communication, and remember, after you've had that kind of thing, don't forget the thank you note. Okay, now, how do you get your work above the horizon? Well, we're still trying to learn that. We've sent people out screensavers. We've sent people out, websites are so important. Blogs. We've got some audio blog things, podcasts that I've done. We've sent out PowerPoints we've prepared to congregations. Some of them actually use them. Emails. Newspapers, again, are getting really hard. Signs and posters sent out are still fairly effective. It costs a lot, unless you can drop them off yourself. But posters in churches are still nice looking. You got to know what you're doing. Make sure you've got who, what, why, when, where, how, and how much. You want me to list that? Who? Do you know the five W's and the two H's? Who? Everything that you write this down. Everything that you communicate with. I've seen people put out lots of posters and not say where it's at, or not say when it's at, or not put down an address. So who is going to be speaking? Who's it for? Who? What? What is it? Who, what, why? Why should they come? Why are you doing it? Who, what, why? When? Again, and I've made these mistakes myself more times than I would like to admit. Who, what, why, where, when? Who, what, why, where, when? How do I get there? How do I sign up? Whatever the how is. And usually you have to have how much if there's some kind of cost. Now, the how much one especially, you know what the one single most powerful word in advertising, and it's the same as it was 75 years ago? Free. Free. Or to let people know, as a free will offering will be received. Put that in the bottom. By the way, this congregation never takes an offering. We receive offerings. The government takes offerings. St. Paul said, we never say it, okay, well, now we're going to take an offering. No. Yeah. We'll say, well, we'll now receive the offering. We don't take it. We're not going to take anybody's money. We're not going to take, I'm sorry, that may sound funny, but the whole thing, the idea of taking an offering, I know, we know what that means, but when you've got a generation that's very, very, three generations that are very sensitive to the money issue, to say, listen, we've even said on Sunday mornings, hey, if you're here the first time, we don't want you to give. We just want you to enjoy and be part, see what we're doing here. And we don't take anything. We'll receive it, whatever people, whatever wherever you're at with thank you, with gratitude and so forth. Faxes, yeah, this has been around for a while. Radio, it's very hard. You might be able to get some of the secular stations to list some of your stuff. Video is a great tool, but it's extremely expensive. It's basically 1 hour of editing for every minute of finished tape. We've done our video series, and thank you notes again, tremendous communicator. What's a leader? A leader asks what's missing, what's possible, and what's next. Those questions are key to being a leader. What's missing? What's possible? That's the big picture stuff. Now, intuitive people tend to think sideways. They tend to make connections. But one of the key things all leaders have to do is they've got to think how they're connected. They've got to think sideways. They can't just think this way. To lead, you've got to be making connections. You've got to be sustaining connections. You've got to be, for the sake of your people, thinking about the big picture. And you can learn to do that. Getting the big picture, make the connections. Okay, that's what I got. Did you need that back up there? Okay, leadership. Leader watches for opportunities. 2 Timothy 4:2, making the most of the time, for the days are evil. Ephesians 5:16. I'm drawing a blank. Ephesians 5:16. Got it? Ephesians 5:16? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I thought you were digging that out. Oh, that's the one. Well, then what's 2 Timothy 4:2? Preaching the word in season and out of season? Okay. All right. All right. Both critical ideas. We preach the word in season and out of season. We look for the opportunities and we let God bear the fruit. And it's going to be challenging sometime. Today we're in a very real dead zone compared to the 70s when there were Christian songs on the pop radio and people were open and so forth. We're in a very, very, very tough time right now. There's two kinds of growth. There's arithmetic, which has got one, you add another 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 one. Nothing wrong with that. That's wonderful that you can, that's how you pick blueberries, and nothing wrong with that. Geometric, if each one reach one, and the idea of I'm going to make 2 disciples, and you're going to make 2 disciples, and they're going to make 2 disciples. The purpose of this class, even though it's a year at a time, is 1 me is going to teach 12 you. Now, hopefully we're going to teach you some stuff that's going to give you some good tools and some ways of thinking. But think through what your model is, what you're trying to do. Yes, we're almost done here. Arithmetic we talked about, okay. Leadership, it doesn't say blessed are the stupid. I've looked for it, it's not there. What does that mean? Forgive me, I don't mean to be rude. Think, learn, study. We've talked about that, huh? Evaluate both from your thought, from your thinking and your feeling. Evaluate ideas from your head and your heart. Hard ideas are great, but you got to think them through. And thinking through ideas are good, but you got to realize what that does emotionally and how to make contact with people emotionally. Who put this animation in here? Communicate with your peers. Leaders need to do that and learn from each other. We've got silo ministries all over this place that people are, it's like nuclear silos. Have you heard this before? Don't try to copy a ministry. Evaluate your situation. Take what is applicable. Every year when it comes time in the summertime, I'd always put in the church newsletter, go out there and steal every good idea you can find. But you can't just copy it. You got to make sure it fits. Wells' first law of parish administration is steal every good idea you can, but you got to make sure it works. And secondly, second law is you can always buy it cheaper somewhere. Okay. Organize only to the point needed. You will each know what is your level of organization. Some people can fly by the seat of their pants easier than others. Some people have to write scripts. You don't have to be somebody else. All you got to be is you. Organize to the point that you need to have it. Some P people are going to need a different kind of organization than J people, and that's okay. If somebody's in your group and they're different than you are, let them work according to their style. Those around you are going to be different. It's okay. God made them that way. Leadership, the inevitability of course corrections. Have your direction, but understand sometimes you got to walk around swamps, sometimes you got to walk around trees, and sometimes other people will do stuff to you that there will be rejection. You can do everything right, and you will have rejection. The Lord of the universe, truth incarnate, stood in front of people, told them nothing but the truth and what would be the best thing for them, and they put nails through his hands and killed him. The Apostle Paul, who wrote us half the New Testament, stood in front of people and told them God's word, and they threw rocks at him several times. Now, you can do everything right, and in the midst of a real world, you'll hit opposition sometimes, and sometimes you will fail. At least it'll look like failure. Only God knows. But don't worry about human reaction and sin. God will make his word bear fruit in time. And one person plants, and another person waters, and another person gathers. And that's frustrating, but that's your task. Follow what God is sending you to do. The Maasai were reached by missionaries for over 100 years, and they had no conversions. And all of a sudden, in the 1980s, there was a huge people movement with signs and wonders, and the Maasai, as a tribe, virtually came to Christ in one swell swoop. You never know how it's going to happen. Sin and brokenness is the source of the conflict, not people. Remember that. So that you understand that the brokenness of the world and the brokenness of sin is what creates the problem. Now, a couple things real quickly I want to talk about. Death and resurrection. Jesus wasn't resurrected till he died first. And I can't tell you how important this is, but virtually every vision that God gives you, everything. I've been through so many death and resurrections of ministry, times when it looked absolutely impossible. It was dead and buried and nailed in the coffin and 5 feet of dirt on it. and yet God resurrected the ministry. It turned out to be tissue paper and smoke and mirrors, but God made it happen. And the other one that you need to think about, so, stick with things. Don't worry about it. It's going to take a while. But the other one is the Egyptian horse proximity phenomenon. Got that one? The waters usually don't part until you can just about smell the horses. I don't know what it is, but give us this day our daily bread. It's not monthly bread. It's not weekly bread. It's daily bread. And so many times when we've been right up against our back, one year we hadn't planned to do a summer program, and we didn't think there was a need, and all of a sudden Minneapolis canceled their summer school, and there were thousands of kids with nothing. And we had planned to close our summer program, and all of a sudden I needed to come up with $10,000 to run a summer program. Not only did that came up about a month before, about 3 days before the time, a donor showed up. He came to us and gave us the money. But many, 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 many times, as you keep moving forward, things don't open until you're right there. It's like one of those proximity things at the grocery store where it doesn't open up when you're halfway through the parking lot. You get about a foot away, about 2 steps away, and it goes. Same thing happens over and over again. Get used to it in ministry, okay? We're almost done. Okay, so let's get going. There's our model: gospel proclamation, human need, and relationships. And if you keep that in mind, that's what we want to give you as the gift of this class for this whole time. So hold on to those things. Jesus said, all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teach them everything I command you. And lo, or surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. And he meant it. We are 5 minutes over. I'm sorry. And you may wish to go back to this to take a look at it as we go. But even as you're thinking about leadership, and as you're thinking about leadership in your organization and so forth, you may find this helpful someday. Now, the other thing that has happened with many people that have taken this class is, I've said other times, you're going to find that you'll come into situations in the future where you'll hit the situation, and what we taught in the class is going to drop like a drop-down menu. And all of a sudden, that piece of what we taught will make sense. It'll just kind of explode and open up, and that'll be what you needed at that time. And maybe it doesn't make much sense right now, but it's there, and someday you might need it. And this has been the thing that people have come back over and over again, was I got in that situation, all of a sudden I realized that I knew what to do, or all of a sudden I realized this is what was going on, and that brought us through. So you may never think of it again or whatever, but hang on to it and tuck it back in your pocket someplace, put it in a drawer somewhere, line the canary cage, whatever. Father, we ask you to bless everybody here and give them a wonderful Christmas, keep them safe and sound and healthy, and bring them back soon. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
When is the next class?
Next class, tomorrow night. No, it's 7th of January, Monday night, 7th of January, 2019. 2019.